Hey everyone, it's Andrea. Today we're going to be discussing the articles over week 5. So if you want to go ahead and pull up the week 5 articles so that you can have them to reference throughout the lecture. The first article that we're going to be discussing is Jerome et al. 2007, The Effects of Errorless Learning and Backward Chaining on the Acquisition of Internet Skills in Adults with Developmental Disabilities. Before we get into the article, I did want to first kind of go over some discussion over task analyses, backwards chaining, and errorless learning so that you kind of have a background as to how these work procedurally before we go into the article. So the first part I wanted to discuss was task analyses, and task analyses are basically just a form of instructions on how to teach a certain skill. Task analyses can be used via writing. You can write out the specific steps of the task, or you can use different pictures to do the steps of the task. You kind of want to choose what's going to be the most effective for the individual. I've even gone so far as to create little cards that are on a ring, and they just flip through each step on a different card on the ring. So it kind of depends on what's going to be the most effective for the client that you're working with. An example of a task analysis I have right here. You can see the words are backwards, but this is a task analysis for how to brush your teeth. And so the first step is get the toothbrush, the second step is get the toothpaste, and then they continue down all the way to the bottom of put everything away. So this is a rough outline of how you can break down toothbrushing into different steps. You can even go as far down to breaking down brushing teeth even further. Brush front teeth, brush side teeth, brush left, brush right, brush top, brush bottom, etc. But this is an example of a simple task analysis, and they're really effective when it comes to teaching new skills, especially skills of daily living. So in the article, they discuss that they taught skills using a task analysis and using backwards chaining. So backwards chaining is important to understand. There are 3 types of chaining procedures. You can have total task chaining, you can have forward chaining, or you can have backwards chaining procedures. This article specifically focuses on backwards chaining, so that's what we'll focus on during the lecture. And with backwards chaining, what they do is they basically have all of the first steps completed for them. So steps 1 through 6 are either already completed if it's able to be completed by a permanent product, or the clinician or the researcher will physically complete each of those steps for the individual, and then the individual only has to complete the last step during backwards chaining when you're first teaching. And the reason for this is if you have an individual who gets easily frustrated when being taught new skills, you want to use a backwards chaining procedure so that they're able to contact that reinforcement much more quickly, and it's not as difficult for them because they're not expected to complete all of the steps within the task, and it's just a little easier for them. So with backwards chaining, let's say, so you teach them, or you complete the first 6 steps, and then it's their responsibility to complete the 7th step, but they don't know how to complete the 7th step, so you're going to have to show them. And several ways that you can use to show how to complete these steps is through different prompt levels. Sorry, my phone's sliding. Through different prompt levels. And the different types of prompts that you can use are full physical prompts, partial physical prompts, modeling, gesturing, showing them basically how to complete that last step. So the first 6 steps are already completed for them, and then it comes to putting everything away. So if they've never done this before and they don't know how, I might physically they'll have the toothbrush, and I'll physically hold their hand and show them where to put the toothbrush. And then they have the toothpaste, and I physically hold their hand and show them where to put the toothpaste. Once they are able to, then we want to fade, because we don't always want to rely on full physical prompts when teaching individuals. We might fade to a partial, where I might just gently guide their hand by the wrist, or I might guide their hand by the elbow, or I might maybe orient them towards the area that they're supposed to be putting away the toothbrush. And that's what's known as most to least prompting, also known as errorless learning. Errorless learning is extremely important when teaching a brand new skill, because if they don't know how to do the skill and you try to use a least to most prompt hierarchy, you might evoke some emotional responding. There might be some problem behaviors because they're frustrated that they don't know how to do the skill. Another important side note to know about errorless learning when teaching new skills is so that you don't accidentally teach a behavior chain. So let's say that you're teaching them to identify different colors. So here we have orange, red, and green. And I say, find red. And they touch the orange. And then I used a least to most prompt procedure. So no, it's not. They didn't get the red. No, they don't get reinforcement. So now since it's least to most, I have to show them where the red is. So then I say, oh, this is the red. Find red. They go here again. They don't get reinforcement. Nope, sorry, red's right here. So there's two things that are happening here. One, they're not gaining reinforcement. Two, they're not actually learning the skill. And then the third thing is we are creating a possible behavior chain of now you're going to say, where's red? And they'll do this. So they think that the answer for where's red is this. And you're not actually teaching them how to discriminate between the different colors, but instead you're teaching this behavior pattern that is not conducive to learning. So that's important to know about errorless learning. So we'll go ahead and move on to the article, Jerome et al., 2007, and they discuss in the intro that it is important to, when teaching leisure skills to adults with developmental disabilities, it's very important to pick activities that are age appropriate. You're not going to want to teach an adult who has developmental disabilities to play with blocks or to color because it's just not age appropriate. Even though they may demonstrate some cognitive deficits in that skill area, we want to try and find leisure activities that are going to be more age appropriate. So some of the choices that they had in the article was computers, and then some of the other choices that I thought of is teaching them how to use iPads or teaching them how to play video games. They're very great for being age appropriate for adults. So this current study did aim to teach adults with autism and with intellectual disabilities. And I wanted to note early on that even though they say MR or mental retardation, according to the DSM-5, there are new terms. It's actually the intellectual developmental disability, IDD, or a lot of times people will just say intellectual disability, ID. So anytime any articles refer to an individual as having a diagnosis of MR, chances are it's because that was the title when they received diagnosis and they didn't receive a new diagnosis to intellectual disability. But just to make sure that we're staying PC, we're going to use the terms intellectual disability in replacement of MR. So they taught appropriate leisure skills. They specifically taught them how to identify preferred websites via the internet. The preferred websites was a music website, and then they identified a specific game website that they really liked to use. And then what they did is they used a combination of errorless learning and backward chaining to teach the different steps of how to find access to their specific website. So participants were Chris and Mark, who were 32 and 24, and they were diagnosed with autism and intellectual disability. And then Ethan, who was 25, was diagnosed with an intellectual disability, and he was also deaf. All sessions were conducted in a day hab facility for adults with intellectual disabilities. So data was collected on the number of steps completed on the task analysis. So you can see in the article the task analysis that they have, which consists of 13 different steps. And basically they broke down the steps that it took to be able to get to Google and then type in a search term and get into Google to then get to the website of their preference. They collected IOA for 53% of the sessions, and the agreement was 100%. Prior to conducting the sessions, the researchers did conduct a preference assessment to determine what types of items are going to be reinforcing during the session. Because even though they were gaining access to 5 minutes of of the preferred internet website, if they did use a backwards chaining procedure, so early on in the training, they were able to gain access to that website relatively quickly. But once you get back to, the second or the first step that they're having to complete all of those independently, it's taking longer for them to gain access to that reinforcement. So they wanted to have supplementary reinforcements in place, to bridge the gap from the time that they actually got to earn 5 minutes of their favorite internet. So what they did is they did a preference assessment, and they were able to identify that the individuals, all 4 individuals, or 3, preferred candy as reinforcement. So for each step that they completed, either independently or prompted, they received a piece of candy to help bridge that gap until they received the larger reinforcement of playing on the preferred website. So basically what they did is in baseline, they had the individuals go over to the computer. They would say, hey, do you want to go play a game on the computer? They would say yes, or they would walk to the computer indicating that they'd want to play. And then they sat down at the computer, and scores were collected on the number of steps that they completed in the task analysis. During the baseline sessions, the experimenter did not provide any type of reinforcement, and they did not provide any type of prompting procedures because we wanted to see where their baseline skills were. So then there was the teaching procedure, and for the first part of it, the first 12 steps of the task analysis would be completed. So then when the individual went to the computer, all they had to do was click on the link to get to the website. So they only had to complete the last step, and then they would gain direct access to the website for 5 minutes. If they weren't able to do this on their own, the researchers used a most to least prompt hierarchy, also known as errorless learning. So those two terms are they're the same. It's a hard word. Those two terms are the same, and they basically mean the same thing. You're prompting using a most to least hierarchy or using errorless learning, but it's the same. So they started with using hand over hand guidance, and then they faded to hand over wrist guidance, and then they faded to the elbow, and then they faded to the shoulder until they were no longer providing prompts for that one step, just step 13. When they could independently complete step 13, then they would move to step 12 and 13. So the researchers would only complete the first 11 steps, and then the participant was expected to complete the 12th and the 13th step. At this point, the 13th step is independent, so you would not provide prompts for that, but the 12th step is not independent, so that you would provide the prompts for the 12th step. And this same procedure continued all the way back until they were able to complete all 13 steps independently on their own. And then what they did, they also conducted generalization probes where they used a computer in a different classroom that was a slightly different computer to see if they were able to generalize these skills across computers and generalize them across environments. So let's go ahead and look at the graph. So in figure 1, you can see sessions are on the x-axis, and number of steps completed for the task analysis are on the y-axis. So if we look in the first here, we have Chris. In baseline, you can see that the filled in black squares are the skills that they were assessing, number of steps on the task. And then in treatment and post-teaching, you can see that there's open circles, and those open circles are representing the generalization probes. So those are representing when they went into the second classroom and they completed these steps using a different computer. And you can see that it was effective for all 3 participants. They were able to learn how to access websites independently using the task analysis, the backwards chaining, and the errorless learning procedure. You can see that there was some generalization maintenance concerns with Mark. You can see he did dip down back to only being able to engage in 1 or 2 steps of the task analysis, but they went back to the computer where he was originally trained, and you can see that his responses go back up to 100% or 13 steps completed. And then just to make sure that it's still generalized, then they went back to the computer in a different room and saw that his skills maintained. If they wanted to add a little bit more of experimental control during the generalization probes, they may have wanted to conduct 2 or 3 more generalization probes, because as you can see, Mark's rate of responding decreased, not rate of responding, but the number of steps completed decreased significantly after the third trial on the generalized computers, suggesting that there could be a possible replication. So I'm kind of interested in seeing what would happen if we saw a couple more data points on that. So overall, future research should extend this method to include choice among a variety of websites. As previously noted, they only looked at a website for playing games and a website for playing music. So they'd want to see if this is possible to do across different websites. And then also they should use more than one generalization computer. Is this going to be different across a Mac versus a PC? There are multiple different colors of computers, different sizes of computers, using a mouse versus using a laptop keypad. So there are many different directions that you could go when looking at generalization for these computers across computers. Okay, so the next the next article that we're going to move on to is the Nigrobruzzi and Sturmy 2010, The Effects of Behavioral Skills Training on Man Training by Staff and Unprompted Vocal Mands by Children. So before we move on to the article, we're going to discuss the procedures a little bit. Behavioral skills training is a training method. It's a behavioral training method that's comprised of instructions, modeling, rehearsal, and feedback. So typically with the instructions component, instructions can be provided either by reading the instructions, or the experimental might vocally say the instructions out loud. So for example, if I'm trying to teach medication safety, I might say, whenever you see medication laying out on a table, you're going to stop, walk away, find an adult, and say medication. And then once that would be the instructions component. And then you'd have the modeling component. So I would stand in front of the medication and I'd say, oh, look, there's medication. I'm going to stop. And I would stop in front of the meds. And then I would walk away from the meds and I would find an adult and I would tell an adult that there's medicine on the table. And I would model all of this while the participant watched the modeling. And then you would have them rehearse. So you say, now it's your turn to practice. You see the meds, what are you going to do? And they're going to show you how they stop, walk away, find an adult, and say medication. Hopefully. If they mess up on any component, you always want to interrupt as soon as they make the mistake and provide individual feedback on the component that they made. Oh, remember, you want to stop and walk away when you see the meds if they sit there instead of walking away. And you would continue through this procedure over and over until they're able to independently notify an adult that there's medication present. And that's kind of the idea of behavioral skills training. And each of the components can be done slightly different. So for example, you can either have the modeling where you're physically modeling yourself, or there's modeling where you are using a video model. So you can have that type of video model in place. And what's nice about a video model is you're pretty much guaranteeing that you'll have procedural integrity with your treatment. If you use a human model, or just modeling like in vivo, then there is the likelihood or the chance that you could have some procedural drift when it comes to the modeling. So there are some pros and cons to having the video versus having a person do the modeling. And so then with MAND training, so MAND training is basically teaching a child or an adult, depending, how to request their wants and needs. So a lot of times individuals with developmental disabilities, or individuals who have autism, or individuals with children, will often engage in problem behaviors in order to get their wants or needs met. So ideally, if you teach somebody how to appropriately request their wants and needs, then they won't need to engage in the problem behaviors to have those needs met. And it's more desirable to have somebody say, I want a cup, please, than it is to have them, drop to the ground and tantrum every time they're thirsty. So with man training, basically it involves, well, and they discuss it a little bit procedurally in this article, which we'll go into further. But basically, man training would be if an individual tries to gain access to a cup, for example, or they gain access to something that they want to drink, you would block that access from them being able to get it, and you would say, "Oh, what do you want?" And then you give them a chance to respond, and you say, and you can teach them either sign language or to request for it vocally, or to exchange a picture, or to use an augmentative communication device. But basically, you would provide that prompt, "What do you want?" And then it gives them the opportunity to say, "I want a drink, please," or to sign for a drink, or to hand over a picture asking for a drink. In addition, when doing man training, it is nice to do the man training yourself or to have staff do the man training, but it's even better if you can teach parents how to accurately implement the man training, because they're the ones who are there for way more often than any of us are ever with the child. So therefore, the child can have multiple opportunities with parents to be able to practice their mans, practice their language, and learn new skills. In addition, it's also beneficial to train teachers or train speech pathologists how to implement these types of procedures, because once again, the teacher is going to have more opportunities in a classroom to provide man training or catch instances in which they can set up specific man training components than if you have a researcher or a staff or an implementer working with them a couple of hours a week. So ideally, you want to provide that training to the caretaker. So during this study, they used 6 children with autism, and the 6 children were ages 2 and 4, and all children were able to imitate vocal models. So typically, if someone can imitate a vocal model, you would want to then teach them the vocal request, because you know that they already have the skills to engage in the vocal model. That's why that was important for them to note that they could imitate vocal models. And what they did is they trained 3 special ed teachers and 3 speech pathologists how to engage in or how to implement the different manding sessions. And all manding sessions were conducted in the classroom. They did conduct generalization probes in a separate room outside of the classroom to see if the manding would generalize to different environments. So here you can see that they have 8 different steps that they used 8 different levels that they used to teach the teachers how to implement the manding procedure. And I did want to point out one small concern that I noticed in some of the levels when they were teaching is the experimenters did mention that when they were teaching the individuals how to man for the item, that they had the item directly in front of the individual's face. So this, it's a bit, if you go to verbal behavior and you look at Skinner's discussion on verbal behavior between tacts and mans, and then the combination of a tact man, you'll kind of understand where I'm coming at from this direction. But basically, if I'm holding the cup in front of you and I am saying, "What do you want?" and the individual says cup, I can't really discern whether or not they're asking for the cup because they want it, or that they're tacting the cup because it's in front of them and they're labeling that cup. So when you're going out as a clinician, you're implementing manding programs, you want to make sure that you set up a mand program so that the item is not necessarily in view, because then that really suggests that they have the motivation for the item, they've come up to you and they've asked you for the item, and it's not in view, so you know that they are truly manding for that item. And then you can provide access to the item as reinforcement for the mand. If I have the item in front of them and they ask for it, it could be a mand because they were motivated, but maybe there is no motivation, we don't know, and they're simply tacting the item. So that's important to note when you are going out and doing manding programs on your own. So you can see here they used this specific procedure to teach the teachers and the speech pathologists how to engage in manding. During baseline, they provided instructions on what a mand was and how to conduct mand training. So a mand is simply a request. It comes from the word command. It was created by Skinner as a way to, and it's a verbal operant that we use to teach others how to request items. They used staff training, which was, they used behavioral skills training to teach the teachers and the speech pathologists how to implement the manding program. And they used instructions, video modeling, role play rehearsal, and performance feedback. During baseline, they did use instructions and they gave them the list, but that's all that they gave them. And so they took baseline data on basically instructional training compared to behavioral skills training to see if behavioral skills training would be more effective in teaching that skill. So let's go ahead and look at the graph. So here you can see on the x-axis is sessions and on the y-axis is the percentage of level 1 mands and the staff members' correct steps in the task analyses. So let's orient to the graph a little more before we talk about the results. And you can see, let's just look at dyad 1, tier 1, and you can see that the open circles are, are the participants responding, and the squares are the staff responding. And the closed dark data points are the generalization probes for the child, and the closed points, the closed squares are the generalization probes for the staff. And you can see that the behavior skills training was effective in increasing the staff's ability to implement the MAND training across all 6 staff. You can also see that it was successful in increasing MANDs across all 6 children. So overall, errorless learning and behavior skills training overall MAND training is effective in increasing MANDs with individuals with autism, and behavioral skills training is effective in teaching caretakers how to implement manding programs. Future research that the authors noted include teaching staff to implement MAND training using a pyramidal approach and modifying the task analysis for group instruction to further increase staff training efficacy. Okay, so we're going to move on to our next article, which is Stokes et al., 2010, a behavioral intervention for teaching tackling skills to high school football athletes. And this is a very important skill to have because if individuals are playing football and tackling or being tackled inaccurately, it actually has led to a pretty significant increase with traumatic brain injury across individuals who've played football for a number of years. For example, football-related injuries between 2001 and 2005 accounted for over 1 million emergency room visits. And some of these injuries did result in a permanent disability. And then I decided to go out and just look some stats up on my own about the NFL. And it turns out that more than 40% of retired NFL players show signs of traumatic brain injury. So it's a pretty significant concern, and it's a pretty big deal, especially if you have either a client you know who is going to join the football team. I had a client who played football, or if you have your own children going to play